All right. Next speaker is Jonas Stalknet, and he'll tell us about loop integrants from light cone geometries. Jonas.
Thank you. Right. So first, I want to just very briefly recall some of the more important aspects of positive geometries, and specifically what I want to do is define for you what is the ABGM momentum amplitude, because that will be important. But the main topic of today is to discuss these light cone geometries and how they can be used to describe loop integrants. Today we're specifically going to talk about this ABGM theory, but there's a very similar story. Almost without any changes, you can apply this to also n equals 4 superYOUNG-Mills. Specifically, we'll be looking at one loop integrants because they're the easiest. Right, and so positive geometry, for me that's a geometry which has a unique canonical form, which I denote by omega, and this canonical form you should roughly interpret as being the scattering amplitude, or in this case, the loop integrant. And the most important property that this canonical form has is that it has logarithmic singularities at and only at the boundaries of the geometry. So let's immediately look at a simple example. If we have this triangle in the xy space, then we can write its canonical form like this. And we see that it has logarithmic singularities exactly when x is equal to 0, y is equal to 0, or 1 minus x minus y is equal to 0, which are exactly the boundaries of this geometry. And I would just like to briefly mention a specific type of geometry which will be important, namely a simple geometry, which is a d-dimensional geometry with exactly d facets meeting at each vertex. So this is an example of a two-dimensional simple geometry because at each vertex, at each of the corners, there's exactly two facets meeting, the two line segments. And the important property of these simple geometries is that their canonical form can be written by simply summing over the vertices. So for example, this first term here in the canonical form, d log x wedge d log y, can be thought of as corresponding to this vertex here, which is where x is 0 and y is equal to 0. Right. So today we're going to be talking about ABGM theory, which is a three-dimensional theory of matter-Chern-Simons with n equals 6 supersymmetry. But you don't really need to know anything about that. The most important things is, first of all, is that it is a theory that lives in 3 space-time dimensions. The only non-vanishing scattering amplitudes are for even number of particles, which I will denote by n is equal to 2k. The particles in this theory are massless, and there is some technicality about different topological branches. We're not going to talk about this, we'll just focus on the positive branch for today. And there is this positive geometry known as the ABGM momentum amplitude, which I denote by this OK, which is a geometry that lives in the space of 3-dimensional spinor helicity variables. So we've encountered spinor helicity variables in 4 dimensions during the workshop. There's a very similar construction in 3D. The only difference is that instead of having a lambda and a lambda tilde, in 3D you only need to have a lambda, essentially. So in this 3-dimensional spinor helicity space, you should think of each point in here as specifying the kinematic data for n massless particles in 3 dimensions. Right? And so we define this geometry in this space, the ABGM momentum amplitude, and its canonical form is exactly the 3-level amplitudes in ABGM theory. So like I said, a point in the ABGM momentum amplitude defines for us the kinematic, the scattering data. And we've seen before that we can equivalently encode this scattering data as a no polygon in dual space. So I'll quickly recap. So we have a momenta, which in spinor helicity variables we can write as lambda lambda. And we simply now claim that it is the difference between xi plus 1 and xi, right? And then because the momenta are massless, that means that xi and xi plus 1 must be light-light separated. So here is 2 examples of these no polygons in 3 dimensions for 4 points and for 6 points. And now we ask the following very simple question. What is the region of our 3-dimensional Minkowski space, which is space-like separated from all the x's? So you can imagine just drawing a light cone from all these points x, and you just ask the question, what is outside of all of these light cones? What is the region of Minkowski space that is outside? Well, clearly, if I go way off into the distance to in the space-like direction, points like all the way over here will be outside of the light cone, right? Of all of the light cones. So this is clearly a non-compact region that just goes off to infinity. But interestingly, there's actually also a region sort of inside of the no polygon that also satisfies this property. And this is what those regions look like for 4 and for 6 points. So they're really just sort of nice curvy versions of polytopes. This is a curvy version of a tetrahedron. And if you look at it long enough, you'll realize that this is a curvy version of a cube. All the facets of these geometries are given by the light cones of the axis, by definition. And the vertices consist of either the axis or these red points, which are triple intersections of light cones. So I'll denote this compact region, these orange geometries on the previous slide, by the letter delta. And they, of course, depend on the specific locations of the axis, right? And then I'll make the following definitions. I'll define delta L to be the geometry where I essentially just place L points, y1 through yl, inside delta, and you require that all of them are mutually space-like separated. So yi minus yj squared needs to be positive for any pair I and j. And then I define the L loop ABGM momentum amplitude by simply attaching to every point lambda in the tree-level momentum amplitude this delta L. Now, note that this delta is dependent on the axis, on the null polygon, and this null polygon is defined for the lambda. So for each lambda, what delta L looks like will be different. Right? Now, why do I make this definition? Because then exactly the canonical form of this geometry is the L loop ABGM integrand. So we see that in the way that the lambda encodes the tree-level structure, these light cone geometries in Minkowski space really capture the full loop level structure. Now, for the rest of the talk, we're just going to focus on one loop. So then we're considering the space where there is one point inside of delta, which is just delta itself, right? So if we want to study one loop, we only need to really study the structure of delta itself. So that's what we're going to do. So here's an example for 8 points. So you have the vertices x1 through x8. And in this case, you have 4 of these triple intersection vertices, the red vertices that you see. But now you can imagine that if we have a different null polygon, then the way that these facets intersect means that there is different of these red vertices, that the way that the light cones intersect means that there's different vertices that are part of the geometry. And it actually turns out that for 8 points, there is 4 different sets of vertices that you can find. However, if I just take one of these vertices and I just move it a little bit, I mean, that will change what the geometry looks like, of course, but it won't drastically change the topology. It's not that I just wiggle one point a little bit around, that then which of these triple intersections are part of the geometry is not going to change, right? So this leads to the idea of chambers. So we have our entire tree-level ABGM momentum amplitude here, the blue pentagon, and we define the chambers such that the structure of delta, which vertices are part of delta, doesn't change as I move around inside the chamber. But when I move from one chamber to the next, then which triple intersections are part of the geometry changes. And the nice thing about slicing it up in this way is that I can write then the full one loop integrand by simply summing over all the chambers, the canonical form of the chamber times the canonical form of this light cone geometry. And we have a complete classification of all the chambers of the tree-level ABGM momentum amplitude. And it turns out that they're given simply by triangulations of 2 kgons. So for 10 points, we just draw 2 pentagons. I label one of them 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, and the other one I label 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. And then I just draw a triangulation. And then I do read off what are the triangles. In this case, it's 1, 3, 5, 1, 5, 9, 5, 7, 9. And those are exactly the light cones which intersect at the vertices of this geometry. So we can label the full set of all chambers by listing all the triangulations of 2 kgons. Furthermore, these light cone geometries turn out to be simple geometries in the sense that I've defined before, and which means that we can find their canonical form also by just summing over the vertices. But like I said, the way that we classify our chambers is exactly by specifying which vertices are part of the geometry. So by knowing all the chambers and by knowing which vertices are part of the geometry, we're essentially done. We can immediately write down a compact formula for the general one loop integrand. So that is all I wanted to say. So to summarize, we've seen that ABGM amplitudes can be constructed through positive geometries, and the loop level structure of these geometries is completely encoded by these light cone geometries in 3-dimensional Minkowski space. Furthermore, the canonical form of these deltas can be found only by studying their vertices. You don't have to do anything fancy about triangulations or push forwards. You just have to study the topology and you can immediately write down what the answer is. And together with our complete knowledge of the chambers, that leads to a very general formula that we can write down. And like I said at the beginning, these ideas are not exclusive to ABGM. You can ask the exact same questions in 4 dimensions. Just imagine a 4-dimensional Minkowski space and you start asking what is the region cut out by the light cones of a null polygon. And the answer is you get one-loop integrants or multiple loop integrants in n equals 4 super Yang-mills. It's the exact same story, and we have done this at 1 loop and at 2 loops. And there's also been results to all loops for these very simple ladder geometries. And currently we're working on some higher loop results in ABGM theory as well. Has some very interesting combinatorial problems associated to it. That is all. Thank you for listening.
Questions for Yona?
So in n equals 4 super Yang-mills, the 2-loop integrand is already not a positive geometry in the
Right.
usual sense.
Mm-hmm.
Is it the same for the ABJM integrand?
Yes, we think so. You will have the same type of internal boundaries appearing.
The fact that the knowledge of the chambers is enough to figure out the geometry, is that related to the fact that it's simple? Does it have to be simple for that to be true?
Well, it sort of depends on how you define your chambers. So by definition, the chambers are specified such that the structure of delta is constant inside the chamber, right? So in the one hand, you can just know the chambers if you, for example, know which inequalities, cut them out of the tree-level geometry, but we take a different approach. We say we just study all the possible structures that delta can have, and then we claim that there must be a region that corresponds to that in the tree-level geometry. So from that perspective, you immediately know what delta is for the chamber by definition. Now, both approaches have their upsides and downsides, but the way that we do it, we automatically know, also for n equals 4 super Yang-mills, it doesn't have to be simple. Just by definition, we know what the delta looks like for each chamber.
Thanks. Any other questions for Yona? Okay, let's thank Yona again.